When I was doing my research to plan out this podcast, I cannot tell you how many times I would type in the birth information for a presidential candidate and I would look at their natal chart and my jaw would drop because there was a pattern that emerged in just about every single election. I don't know if I am the first person to discover this, but let's talk about it. I happened to stumble upon this very accurate predictive algorithm when looking at all of the natal charts of both the presidential candidates who won, as well as the natal charts for the candidates who ran against them in all previous elections. Now, although this predictive algorithm is not 100% accurate all of the time, I found it to be about 95% accurate. So let me give you a little overview of how the algorithm works. I'm not going to explain the entire algorithm because that would make this video extremely long and also honestly pretty boring. However, astrologers who are more on the advanced level will be able to understand what I'm talking about and figure this out. Also, I want to say before I begin, I am not endorsing any candidate. I do not align fully politically with the platform of any of the presidential candidates. I will be voting in November, and so should you. That being said, let's talk about this algorithm. So the primary thing that I'm looking at when using this predictive algorithm are the transiting nodes. And the node, I'm going to put a little graphic here, is a measurement of the specific point where the ecliptic of the sun and moon intersect. So you can see on this graphic where that point is in space. And the node is significant for a lot of reasons in astrology, but the reason this point is significant in the sky outside of astrology is because when a new or full moon happens very close to this ecliptic intersection, that is when an eclipse happens. So this measurement is what we use to determine when eclipse season happens. In astrology, the North Node represents destiny, purpose, or what I like to think of it as is what is fated. What happens during eclipse season from an astrological point of view is events that we don't necessarily have control over. That's why you hear a lot of astrologers say, don't manifest during eclipse season. Eclipses can be very karmic, for better or worse. Whether you are following your destiny or not, depending on whether or not you are following your destiny, will determine how those eclipses play out for you on a personal level. And perhaps if you've been following astrology for a long time, you understand the nature of eclipses. You can look back on your life and look at the dates when eclipses happen, and you can see specific events that unfolded under those eclipses. So a complete nodal cycle, a cycle where the nodes travel through every sign on the zodiac, that happens around every 18.6 years. So the nodes are a slow-moving celestial body. It's not like the moon or Mercury where they move very quickly around the sun. This is a very slow-moving celestial body where only every 18.6 years or so will you have this specific configuration in synastry with the transiting chart. Like for instance, think about Jupiter cycles. Perhaps you've heard astrologers talk about that before. When you have a very benefic transit of Jupiter, you really want to take advantage of that because it's only going to happen every 12 years or so. And the nodes actually move much slower than that. So keep that in mind as I am explaining this algorithm. Only once every 18.6 years will you have the North Node conjunct your ascendant. Only once every 18.6 years will you have the North Node conjunct your Sun, and so on and so forth. What I'm going to be mostly looking at in these charts is what I call the public-facing placements, which are the ascendant, the midheaven, and the sun. Again, I'm not going to try to get too technical with this because that would make this video like 3 hours long. I'm going to be referencing some previous election cycles in this as well and how this has played out because I think, and many astrologers would agree, that the best way to make predictions is to look at how the history played out. So like I said, I went through to every single election cycle and I made the natal chart of every single president, as well as the people who ran against them. And I saw this bizarre thing happen over and over. It started because I was looking at Donald Trump's natal chart and I was like, well, we have information from the last 2 election cycles. One election which he won and one which he lost. So perhaps having that information can help inform how I will make a prediction in 2024. And I immediately saw this pattern emerge. So I said, well, let me make Barack Obama's natal chart. Again, there was the pattern. So I said, okay, let me try this for George W. Bush. Again, the pattern emerged. So then I was like, okay, what about Bill Clinton? And so on and so forth, all the way back to George Washington. And when I tell you my jaw dropped pretty much every single time, I was like, wow, this has been a consistent thing to show up in the candidate's natal chart during the time of the election or the inauguration. And some other patterns emerged as well. So I'm just going to give a few examples. For instance, the elections that Barack Obama ran in, this specific pattern correlated like very heavily. In 2008, Barack Obama had the transiting North Node conjunct his ascendant. And then in 2012, he had the transiting North Node conjunct his midheaven. In the year 2000, when George W. Bush was running against Al Gore, George Bush had the transiting North Node conjunct his sun. Al Gore had the transiting North Node in his 12th house, which I found to be very common in candidates who lost. And then in 2004, when George Bush ran for president again, he had the North Node transiting through his 10th house, which is very close to the midheaven, and his opponent, John Kerry, had the North Node transiting through, again, the 12th house. Bill Clinton. 1996, he ran against Bob Dole. Bill Clinton had the North Node conjunct his ascendant during the time of the election. Bob Dole had the North Node in his 12th house. Bill Clinton, of course, won. In 1992, when Bill Clinton ran. And now this is where we run into one of these other patterns that emerged. 1992, Bill Clinton was going through his nodal reversal. What I found to be true of presidents who had a nodal reversal or a nodal return happen during the time of the election or their presidency is that there was particular scandal involved in the presidency. And if you remember, Bill Clinton was one of the only presidents to be impeached for having an extramarital affair. However, it was a stronger nodal correlation in his chart than George H.W. Bush had, who was running against him at the time. And so Bill Clinton won. Now, before I talk about the predictions for 2024, I want to talk about this emerging pattern of the nodal return or nodal reversal in different presidents' charts when they were running or inaugurated. Because again, a pattern emerged here as well. So Donald Trump actually had this in his chart when he lost in 2020. And I'm going to come back to the astrology of that election because that one is particularly interesting as well. However, we all know of all the various scandals that Donald Trump has been involved in. And having a nodal return or reversal seems to bring about major controversy surrounding the president's legacy or unusual events occurring during their presidency. So immediately we are seeing a pattern here. Both of these presidents have been impeached for one reason or another. Both of these presidents have controversies surrounding their legacy. Going a bit further back in time, Ronald Reagan had this in his chart. Reaganomics, big controversy. Richard Nixon had this in his chart. We all know about the Watergate scandal. I'm just going to name a couple more. Lyndon B. Johnson had this in his chart after he assumed office after JFK was assassinated. Abraham Lincoln had this in his chart in 1864. And we all know that Abraham Lincoln was the one to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which essentially ended slavery. And then subsequently, he was assassinated. So you can begin to see a pattern emerging here. So in 2020, when Donald Trump ran for president, he was experiencing his nodal return. He is actually the only president to have run during the time of a nodal return and lost. I think his whole legacy and all of the scandals involved, it's particularly interesting to see this happen in his chart at that time when it was just like opening Pandora's box of all of these scandals. And since then, it's continued to happen. Throughout this entire master document that I've put together, there have been 36 instances where a conjunction of the North Node and a personal public-facing placement, like I said, the sun, ascendant, or midheaven, have been present in a president's chart during the time of the election or inauguration, or even during the time of the assumption of presidency, when one president has either had to step down or died in office, and the vice president has had to assume office. I looked at the dates for those as well, and this pattern seems to emerge as well for the vice presidents who do eventually become president. There were 7 instances where a nodal return or reversal in a candidate's chart has led to victory. There were 5 cases where the North Node being present in the 10th house, close to the midheaven, where a candidate has won the election or assumed presidency, and 54 cases in total where positive synastry with the transiting nodes with the candidate's chart has led to their victory or assumption of presidency. So during each cycle, what I found is that the candidate with the stronger relationship to the transiting North Node was the one to win the election 95% of the time. And also, another pattern emerged. I found that when a president won the election, despite having the astrological odds in their favor, many times they were either assassinated or died in office. Let me give you a few examples. Abraham Lincoln, 1860. He ran against John Breckinridge, who had the North Node conjunct his sun. Abraham Lincoln had the North Node conjunct the moon at this time. However, that is not a correlation according to this algorithm that I have formulated. He was assassinated. William McKinley, in 1900, when he ran, he had the North Node trine his midheaven. However, the person who was opposing him, Jennings Bryan, had the North Node conjunct his ascendant. William McKinley was assassinated. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which I would love to make a separate video about his presidency and the astrology surrounding it, but that's for another video. This one is particularly interesting because he won 4 elections in a row. He is the only president to have done this. 3 of those elections, he had the more favorable astrology. The last election that he ran in, he had the North Node sextile his ascendant, which is not a strong correlation. But Thomas E. Dewey had the North Node conjunct his midheaven, which is a stronger correlation according to this algorithm. And as some of us know, Franklin Delano Roosevelt died in office. So, now that I've laid that all out on the table, I do want to talk about some things that are happening and have happened in Donald Trump's chart, as well as what is happening in Kamala Harris's chart. I've heard a lot of astrologers talk about the transits of Jupiter for this election and how they're making predictions based off of Jupiter transits. And although transiting Jupiter is going to be conjunct Donald Trump's natal North Node and Sun, which is his ruling celestial body because he is a Leo rising, I don't think that that is a strong enough correlation to determine that he will be the winner of this presidential election. Now, like I said, he had the nodal reversal happen in 2020. And that does bring about unusual events and often controversies in a president's legacy. I do think we have seen a lot of that play out so far. Another thing that I've heard a lot of astrologers talk about is how transiting Uranus is conjunct his midheaven, the most public area of his chart. But if you remember back to when this was activated in his chart, when Mars conjunct transiting Uranus on his natal midheaven, that was when the assassination attempt happened. So this transit has not been very favorable for him, at least so far. Uranus is very unpredictable. However, so far, it's been pretty rough for him in terms of the Uranus transits. Also, the main thing that I am looking at to be the predictive factor in every other presidential election is the transiting North Node. And during the election, as well as the inauguration, there is no correlation happening in Donald Trump's chart. The transiting North Node will be in his 8th house in 2025. And I even went a bit further and I looked at 2028. And again, there is no correlation. It is actually in a particularly bad configuration when in synastry with his natal chart. Also, he'll be 82 in 2028. So I don't know if that really says anything because we do have a lot of geriatric politicians in the United States, but the astrology for him in 2028 does not look great. So now I am looking at Kamala Harris's chart. So one thing in particular really stood out for me when I was looking at the astrology of the rest of the year, which is that on September 17th, there will be an eclipse in Kamala Harris's 10th house. Now, remember back to the beginning of the video when I was talking about what the significance of the nodes is in the transiting chart. It is where the eclipses happen. So this is happening in her 10th house of career, of public image. So I think that on September 17th, 18th, plus or minus a few days, there will be some sort of big event happening in Kamala Harris's life that will kind of show us what is fated for her. Also, I talked about the Jupiter placement in Donald Trump's chart. In Kamala Harris's chart, transiting Jupiter is actually conjunct her ascendant during the election, separating about 4 degrees. Transiting Jupiter is also conjunct her natal North Node. Now, this is interesting because both candidates have almost the same exact nodal placement. Transiting Jupiter is conjunct Donald Trump's natal North Node and Kamala Harris's natal North Node. This This is wild to me. Based on the nodal placement alone, I would say that Kamala Harris has more of a chance of winning this election. She does have some difficult astrology happening at the same time as this nodal transit. And this is the case for literally everyone and anyone. Nothing is always just sunshine and roses. She has transiting Pluto square her Mercury, which is her ruling planet. Transiting Pluto is also square her natal moon and sun. She was born on a full moon. Guess who else was born on a full moon? Donald Trump. The similarities between what's going on in both of their charts, it's just like, this does seem very fated. It's very bizarre. The one thing I will say about the Pluto transits that are happening to Kamala Harris's chart is that these have been going on for a while now. This is something that has been activated in her chart for quite some time. A Pluto transit can be difficult. However, Pluto is also the planet that represents power, transformation. I have had many Pluto transits in my life, and so I am no stranger to this. Some of them have been positive, some of them not so much. But Pluto is also very karmic, so I think that we will see this play out, especially if she is elected over the course of her life over the next few years. Now, there were some other things that came up just in the astrology of this election. This election is happening in close proximity to eclipse season. So I think that leading up to the election, there are probably going to be some dramatic events. Now, one important thing to mention about the 2020 election that I sort of mentioned before is that Donald Trump was experiencing his nodal return, and he actually had the stronger relationship between his natal placements and the transiting North Node than Joe Biden did at the time. Now, I think this is particularly interesting because Joe Biden was running for president. However, he stepped down. Now, like I said, in the past, historically, when this has happened, it has led to a president essentially being dethroned in one way or another. Perhaps with him stepping down, that astrology has played out. I do really believe that this eclipse in Kamala Harris's 10th house, again, close to the midheaven, the most public-facing area of the chart, on September 17th, is very significant to how the election is going to play out and perhaps bring some sort of chaotic events. This eclipse is also very active in Joe Biden's chart. The axis of the eclipse is essentially happening right on his midheaven. And Uranus will also be opposing his sun at this time. Again, Uranus is the planet of shocks, surprises. When Uranus and Mars were conjunct Donald Trump's midheaven, there was an assassination attempt. Now, I'm not insinuating that something like that is going to happen to Joe Biden, but I do think that this will be a very significant date for both Kamala Harris and Joe Biden. Again, plus or minus a few days. Eclipses are not a specific moment. It is a marathon. So there could be things happening that whole week surrounding the eclipse. So who do I think will win the presidential election based on astrology? I do think that there are a lot of special little nuances here in each of the candidates' charts. However, based on the correlation of the transiting nodes, I would say that Kamala Harris has a stronger chance of winning the election. Based on the astrology of both election day as well as the astrology leading up to the inauguration, I do not think this is going to be an easy election. On election day, we have Pluto sitting at 29 degrees Capricorn, Neptune sitting at 27 degrees Pisces, and Uranus sitting at 25 degrees Taurus. And if you look at the chart, you can see that there is something called a grand minor trine, loosely forming between these three celestial bodies. I have talked about this in previous videos. I'm going to do a deep dive on it. To basically just summarize what all of this means, we have three outer, slow-moving celestial bodies, all at the end of a sign, about to ingress into the following sign. Whenever an outer celestial body ingresses into a new sign, it's like it's the next paragraph of a novel. A new theme is introduced. There is a bit of a shift. So we have three outer celestial bodies that are about to ingress into a new sign, literally all happening within a very short period of time. If you notice, on November 6th, Uranus and Neptune are both retrograde. The numbers are in red. And Pluto only recently stationed direct. When planets are retrograde, it feels like we are regressing. We are moving backwards. However, planets do not actually move backwards. They just appear to move backwards from the point of view of the Earth. So I think a big theme during this election cycle and during the transfer of power is going to feel like we are regressing. It is going to feel like we are moving backwards. And I'm saying this because once all of these celestial bodies ingress into the next sign, they're going to form a grand minor trine in the new signs. And I truly believe, I'm going to save a lot of what I want to say for my deep dive video, but I truly believe that this is the beginning of a new paradigm. We are not just starting a new paragraph, like I said, when a celestial body ingresses into the next sign. All three of these are moving at once. We are starting a new chapter, maybe even a new book. So there is a lot of tension in the chart for the election cycle. Also, if you notice, transiting Mars is opposite Pluto on that day. It's just like the cherry on top of the sundae. Mars is the warrior, it is the aggressor, and Pluto is Hades. Pluto is the ruler of the underworld. Now, this aspect will be separating. Mars moves fairly quickly, but I just see a lot of tension happening on election day until basically 2025, when these transits will kind of resolve and complete. All of this is to say, stay hopeful. If you are reading news that stresses you out, come back to your center. Maybe take a few deep breaths. Never hurt anyone. I am personally choosing optimism because I can see in the stars that things feel very tense. However, when I fast forward the chart a little bit into 2025, I see some very exciting things happening. So do not fret. Again, please vote, have your voice heard, and have faith that things will work out. I am going to be doing another deep dive on that grand minor trine, so stay tuned for that, and I'll see you next time.